Well, hello everybody. Today we're going to have Jose Arce talk about SpecFlow, which is one of these testing strategies. And so you notice there's a testing theme about the last couple of months. We'll change to a different theme soon. Jose's been at Horace Mann for a number of years as a contractor and also as a full-time employee. Right now he's a solution engineer at Horace Mann. He's been in the Springfield area for a long time, went to school here, actually worked here, so I can't have the excuse of like, well, why in heck did you move to Springfield? He didn't know any better. Maybe he'll move out one of these days, but who knows? That's a different issue. But Jose's been programming for a number of years, cares about technology, willing to look at sometimes new and different things. If you remember, he's talked about NoSQL, but today, SpecFlow, I'm interested to see what he's got to say, and he can introduce himself for the rest of it. So, welcome, Jose.
Hello, everyone. I know quite a few people in this room. You know, most of you might know me as a general rabble-rouser. I've been doing .NET for, I think, a little bit over 10 years. I really like programming. I like to do, especially things that's usually on the cutting edge. Now, this topic isn't that cutting edge, but if you guys look on your screen, you'll see a zoom in on the Mandelbrot set. Now, for you who have been watching it, you can probably see that this has quite a few different patterns in it. And what might surprise you is if we pull up the Mandelbrot set on Wiki, and you see what I have lighted it here, this is basically the equation that drives all that complexity. Now, the reason I put this on the screen is there's going to be some things I talk about testing that are my opinion. I'll call those out. They're just my opinion. They're not industry things. But I am one of those people who thinks it's impossible to test everything. And so I kind of show this cute little Mandelbrot thing to kind of try to drive that point home. Depending on how you test, I think that's going to depend on the kind of efficiency you gain, the kind of value you get out of your testing. So I'm very much for taking a pragmatic approach to testing. And so with that being said, let's talk about SpecFlow. So SpecFlow is an open source tool. It enables basically behavior-driven development in .NET. You can get all the source code for it on GitHub. It's there. It's available. You could contribute if you wanted to. It happens to be free under a BSD license. It uses an established language called Gherkin, and I'll show you that when we get to the code. But it pretty much reads like English, which then gets bound to actual code, and in this case it'll be C#. SpecFlow compiles down from its Gherkin into things that you should recognize, basically either NUnit tests or MS tests. In this case, we did MS tests. They're what I know. I hate to say I prefer them since I haven't used the others, so that wouldn't really be fair to NUnit, but MS tests work fine for me. So, what is behavior-driven development? In the intro, when I showed you the Mandelbrot set, part of what's really significant about this tool is that it starts from the point of view of your user, which is typically your domain expert. So they have a specification. The cheesy one that you can find 1,000 examples on the internet for is a registration button on a website. So if you had a story come in, say in an agile world, that said, you know, create a registration system for our website. They might have a user acceptance story that says, I go to this particular URL, I'm presented with a series of text boxes, I fill them in, I hit the register button, there might be a few conditions based on errors or whatnot, but for the most part, I get registered. And then I get a screen that confirms that, and I get an email, etc. That's the way the user would view that system. That's a good specification for something that you would want to work if you're writing a registration page. So what SpecFlow does is it enables that. And when you get into the code, you'll see part of how it does that. So I think that's very cool. For those of you who have written unit tests, it's easy to get lost writing tests against classes. So these things are technical. There's nothing wrong with unit tests, and in a lot of cases, SpecFlow is not meant to completely replace unit testing. It's a superset, the way to describe it. But it tends to be more based around your code. And it might make sense to a programmer, whereas doing specifications, behavior-driven development, it's based really on the functionality that your user expects out of your system. So that's very, I can't stress enough how huge that is, because it adds a lot of value in a lot of different ways. It's aligned to the business function, so what that means technically is it tends to be more coarsely grained. So you're usually not testing, one method in one class that you've gone and isolated from all other methods and done a really deep dive into just that method to test, because you're looking at it more from the point of view of a user. So you're probably looking at least at service level functions, register user, complete order, cancel order, those sorts of things. So does that make sense to everyone? Any questions on that? One of the biggest benefits of SpecFlow is that because it's sort of at that level with the domain expert, is we can kind of steal from domain-driven development, and we can actually use SpecFlow to tie into our ubiquitous language. And when I've used it, I've actually found that if we don't have a ubiquitous language, it helps define a ubiquitous language. Does everyone know what a ubiquitous language is? From the concept from design-driven development? Okay, so a ubiquitous language is a way to talk about the software system that both makes sense to the engineer and to the user. So what you do is you negotiate on terms. Usually it's mostly you learning the domain, whatever it is your problem you're trying to solve, and coming up with very descriptive, powerful ways to describe pieces of the system efficiently in a way that it makes sense. So your business user could say, hey, I need you to add this X and this and change the Y, and it makes sense to you. You don't need what's called a translator. Does that make sense? Okay. The other thing I'll show you real quick is this, because every time I talk about Blackbox, Greybox testing, people are like, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, well, do I know what I'm talking about? So I went and I looked it up. And here are some definitions for Blackbox, versus Greybox versus white box testing. But really, from the most part, I always understood this concept visually. So if you look at your system, pretend your system is the box on the screen. Now, most people work for QA department. Is that correct? Who here doesn't work for QA team to vet their code when they push it to production? Okay, I feel sorry for you guys. It's the first thing I'll say. I feel sorry for you too. But most of us in civilized society have a group of people who relieve a lot of stress from us by testing our system for us. A lot of times those people may have tools that drive a website or drive a UI screen or whatever it is, method you have of inputting into your system and create some tests around it. They tend to be black box testers, right? They don't know C#, they don't know .NET, they don't know Java, they don't care. They approach the system fully from the outside, and then they create inputs, and then they verify results, either visually or hopefully you can get them to automate that. On the other side of the spectrum, what you should all be more familiar with is everyone's done unit tests, or read about them at least. So that's considered white box testing. White box testing is, from the point of view of the system, you see completely through it. You understand it. In other words, you can read code. So if it's C#, you're writing a test for it, and you know how it works because you can read the code. So typically, unit tests fall in that spectrum. The Greybox kind of tries to have it both ways. It's somewhere in the middle. It is a place where you can write tests, but it does kind of require you to have some knowledge of the inside of the system, but not as complete as you would in a unit test scenario. Now, the reason I'm showing this is SpecFlow is just a piece of technology, and it can be used in any one of these contexts. You could use it as a black box testing tool. You could use it to write unit tests, and I'll admit I frankly have done that and with great success. That's an opinion, by the way. You can also use it to write, more Greybox tests. So any questions on that? I just wanted to give a little visual of that. Okay, so some of the key benefits that I found with SpecFlow is because of the Gherkin language, there's a lot of reusability. And I'm just going to say that now because until you see the code, you guys are not going to know what that means. I talked about how it helps with the ubiquitous language. It's very lightweight. It's very minimalistic. So I made my presentation conveniently as very minimalistic. There's no flashy fade outs or anything. It's incredibly intuitive. It's highly a convention over configuration framework that you're using, and I found it to be incredibly well suited. Okay, covered that. So here's the slide. I'm going to quickly go over what we're going to cover, and then I'm going to kind of keep this up to remind me because I don't have a note card of what the heck I'm doing and make sure I hit every one of these topics. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read these out, and then we're going to dig into the code. We'll talk about installation, documentation, boring. We'll talk about features within SpecFlow. There's an actual feature concept. We'll talk about the background command within SpecFlow. We'll talk about scenarios. Within scenarios, we'll talk about the scenario context. Then we'll dive into steps, given, when, then, parameters, bindings. And then if we have some time, I might go into some more advanced topics. And maybe we'll just leave this as, probably what I'll do is I'll leave this for the question and answer. So I'll bring this back up on QA, and if you guys want to know about it, I'll dig into it. So any questions? Okay. So that being said, enough of that part, and the part that people care about is now here. So installation, two things you have to do. First, I have the links up in the presentation. I'll gladly give them to you, but you need an extension. So if you just type Bing. If you just type SpecFlow extension in there, you'll see Visual Studio Gallery. Here's the link. You can get it. Install that first. You should have NuGet already. If not, you should be sad, and you should get it because it's really nice. And if you have NuGet, the other step to do is to go in and make sure that you set it up for your project. So I'm just going to do manage. I've already picked it out. It's under SpecFlow. Once you find it on NuGet, you can assign it to whatever project you have. Usually you're going to assign it to your testing project. Now this test project is just a normal, here's the actual project where I put it in here. Here are the references. It adds techtalk.specflow. I'll show you how I did this just to be thorough, but since it's already laid out, you just create a new test project, and then you add it in there. So what we have here for my SpecFlow session is I have a tic-tac-toe game I use for various things. I do some research on evolution stuff, hobbyist type kind of stuff. And in order to do that, I needed a tic-tac-toe game engine. So I wrote one. And that's what my test is based on. So I have a tic-tac-toe engine that I wrote, but it was a long time ago. So to kind of make things clean, I created an interface for it called iGameProvider. So here we have some methods that basically allow you to play a full tic-tac-toe game. And the engine accepts inputs for making a move. It tells you what the current player is, allows you to reset the game, it gives you a status. These are all enumerations. Let's show you. I picked tic-tac-toe because everybody knows how to play tic-tac-toe. Okay. I guess nobody would admit if they didn't, would they? So shouldn't ask that question. But we have game player enumerations for its first, second, the state, whether it's empty, first player, second player, the status of the game, whether it's in play, whether it's a draw, whether it's first player one, second player one, and then some game board location, top left, top center, top right. Think about this if you're looking at a tic-tac-toe board. Top left. The best thing I could think of. I'm still not very happy with that approach. You could have done it mathematically. I did it that way. Okay, so that's sort of the domain. Everyone should be familiar with the domain. So I have this interface. I created an adapter, and this is not about adapter patterns, so I'm not going to cover that. But essentially, I new up my game, which is private, and I create this game adapter, which implements the interface, and it routes all the commands to the game. I'm glad I did it this way, though, because in the definitions, this definitions project, I actually have enumerations also that are essentially the same ones as these over here. But they're not, right? .NET doesn't know that. It's just a different type. It doesn't care that I happen to define them almost exactly the same in a different namespace. So the adapter has to translate from one to the other. And as a result, I have a lot of extensions that don't completely do fully trivial. I mean, they do somewhat trivial thing, but this is converting this enum to that enum. Can you guys see that? I mean, this is just the kind of code that I love to screw up. I mean, it's boring. It's easy to forget. You don't even want to write it in the first place. So I thought it was great that I had to do this and then write the tests. So all this does is this is going to go ahead and feed into it so we can test it. So I've written my tic-tac-toe engine. I have an interface. Let's look at SpecFlow. Any questions about that? So pretty simple. What's that? No. All right, so what is SpecFlow? Okay, well, what it technically is you install it via NuGet and you do the extension, and then you get this new file, and it's called the feature file. That's the extension it has. So once you've done everything right, and one way to verify you've done everything right is you can go into your test project, you can say add, new item, and then at the very top you guys can see these SpecFlow options. It's the feature file is the one I usually work with. Now, I guess I could have been really advanced and known what these two are, but I don't. I never needed them, so that's where I stopped. But all the other features that are in, I'm pretty savvy with. So that's all I did to create this specification. The specification here, this is now we're in Gherkin. So what we have is we have some things. This little bit, this with the @ is called a tag. You can use tags to decorate features or scenarios, and I believe even steps, although I've never done that. Here we have the main sets. The feature is the name of all of what you're trying to test. So in this case, I made it very broad. I just say it's just a set of tests that represent the main level specifications. A background step is something that runs for every scenario. So a feature file is one feature, and it can have one or more scenarios in it. When you define a background, it's basically pretend that this is inserted here and is inserted here and in any other one that's in here. Does that make sense? Programmatically, at least. So that's not really that important. The meat of it is in the scenario. In the scenario, it follows a given, when, then format. You guys familiar with this? Or it's also known as a range act assert. So the first step you do is you set up the conditions for what you're trying to test. In this case, there's a method on my provider that resets the game. So let's just read through this in English and make sure we understand it. It makes sense. Given the following moves have been made: top left, top center, top right, middle left, middle center, middle right. Maybe it should have said in the order that they appear, because that's really what it's doing. When I reset the game, that's your act, then I verify all these things, that the board is in this current state, that the current player is first, that if I try to undo the last move, it results in an error. And the reason we do that is if we go to the definition, we see that the undo last move, if it's not done right, we'll throw an exception. That's in the documentation for the interface, so we've honored that when we test that, because if we reset the game, nobody's made a move yet, right? So if I call undo last move, we throw an exception. Now let's talk about whether that's good design later. I left that in there on purpose. Maybe we change our mind and we can see how we can change that and fix the test. Or fix the test and then change it, I guess, if you guys are purists. I verify that the total number of moves made is 0. I verify that the game status is in play. If no moves have been made, it's in play. And I verify that if I call the engine to say what are all the valid moves, it should tell me that everything's valid. I can move anywhere I want to move. So can everyone read that? Does that just make sense? If you're a domain expert, that is a tic-tac-toe player, could you read this test and understand what it was trying to test? You might need a little bit of knowledge, right? Like, well, what is top left? What is top center? And that's why I feel SpecFlow is not fully black box. But it could be. If you wanted to drive it from, let's say, a UI, you might need another WebDriver tool like Watt-in, I think. There's a few that you could use. That's the one that they advertise. But in this case, just having that API and knowing a little bit of knowledge about the system, in this case just a convention, I think you can read that, and that reads pretty straightforward. Anyone disagree? Because I'm willing to fight about it right now if you disagree. So if you don't disagree now, you don't get to disagree later. All right, everyone agrees. All right, so let's look into what this actually is. Every one of these steps here there's a few different types, but you can have a step that simply, let's start with the simplest one. This when, they all bind to C# code. So if I was to create a new one, given I order a hamburger. This doesn't make any sense in this domain, but I'm just going to put that in there. Can you guys see that color differentiation? What the SpecFlow engine's telling us, and if I build it, oh, it lets me build? Okay. But it shouldn't let me run the tests. And I go to run the tests. Oh, it's this one. Sorry, it's been a while since I've been in 2010. Thanks a lot, by the way. It tells me inconclusive, and if I go view test result details, it basically says, hey, I tried to run your test, but I couldn't because I don't know what this, I couldn't find the binding on this method. So I can right-click on this, and there's a lot of ways to do this, but there's only one way to do this. So I'm going to show you the one way you need to do this because it's the smart way to do it. You say generate step definitions, and it'll show you everything that's not been bound yet and let you select it or not selected. And you can have it try to generate it in Visual Studio, and it sticks it in some god-awful place, and then you hate yourself. Or you can just say, I'm going to just copy these to the clipboard. Thank you. Don't do that part for me. You can come out to a code file you have in your test project, and you can go ahead and drop this method in here. Now, how SpecFlow works under the covers is it uses attributes to put everything together. So the first thing that has to happen is if you're going to define steps for a SpecFlow feature, you must decorate the class with this binding attribute. If you don't do that, it'll never find it. Once you've done that, you must, you can go ahead, and you could actually manually create this. Notice this is all very intuitive. I just happen to use the UI to do it. Then you create this given step, where it's either given, when, then, whatever type of step it is, and text that usually contains the regular expression and whatnot for pattern matching. But in this case, since I don't have any input for that particular step, this is just to go do it. It just basically says, hey, anything that matches this string, and I don't believe it's case sensitive. I do not believe it's case sensitive, just by the way. If I find a method that matches this string, go execute it. If you have to, it'll give you an error. And the code it generates puts it in a pending state, so if I was to run it again, I still get an inconclusive, and the reason I get an inconclusive is when it executes the step, we just do a pending. Now, if I just did nothing, right, which you wouldn't want to do, but if that's what I did, then it's actually executing the step, but it's not doing anything. So that's how you bind what you're seeing from the Gherkin to C#, or I don't even know if it supports VB, frankly, but would it be terrible to admit I don't care if it does or not? So, okay. Everyone, does that make sense to everyone? Because that's the most basic thing. Okay. So now we have some complexity. Well, that's great for when I want to bind a step, but what if I need to have some data? What if I need a step that does some more intelligent stuff? Well, let's up the complexity. I have a then step that says I verify that the current player is, and then this quotes you have first. So I can go to definition if it's already bound. Incredibly handy. I mean, how sweet is that? I can open up where it's bound, and I can see that here's the text expression it's using. It's using a regular expression, I believe, and I suck at those, so I never try to fiddle with them, but if you're good at it, you could probably do it all manually. And now this method has an input, P0, parameter 0. And it's even smart enough in some cases to guess the type based on what you put in that. Make it an integer or whatever. So this is a step that's receiving input directly. So whatever you would put here, or in this case your business analyst, would filter down to the test, where then I can use that to write some code to execute that step. Does that make sense to everyone? Pretty simple. This stuff is all minimalistic, and this is what I can't emphasize. This is why I love the most about it. Is that it ain't complicated, and yet it's very powerful. All right, so then the last thing we can have in here is a step that actually has data in it in tabular form. And this is the most complicated scenario. So if we go in here and we go to the step definition, everything comes in as a table object. Table is a class that they've defined for this library. And it's a very generic thing. It basically has the names of properties and their values. But what's really neat about this, and if you remember one thing and you're going to use SpecFlow, this is what I want you to remember, is they have an assist. They have basically a bunch of extension methods that I don't know why they're not in the default namespace. I mean, they're so great, they should be. We happen to discover them, and if you're new to using SpecFlow, you might think these things didn't exist, but if you add this using statement, you basically get a bunch of really sweet methods. And one of the methods you get is the ability to do a create set. Table.create set, and you pass it into type. And this is all generic. So basically what I'm saying is, hey, take that table full of data and create me a set of these board locations. The board location is just a POCO that defines one property called location. So what SpecFlow does is, as long as the title for your table matches a property within that class, he's just going to fill it. He's going to create a bunch of those objects, and he's going to hand it to me. So I think that's pretty cool. If I had more properties on that object, but I'm just interested for the purpose of testing, I want to focus in on what I'm testing, and I had 3 more properties in board location, SpecFlow doesn't care. He'll fill what you've defined and leave the rest, whatever it is, the default, either based on the constructor or when it got newed up. So it's very powerful. And in a lot of cases, if you guys are doing, if you have objects that you're passing in for service calls or whatever, you can basically map your steps directly to those objects that you feed right in to say, place, order. Here's the order object. Build it up in your when steps. In your act step, say submit order, and then do your verification. The same way, by the way, on the objects that come back. So any questions on that? Straightforward? And I'm willing to spend some time on this because this is the more complicated case. Let me show you the table again. Off of table. Oh, geez, go away. There is, you can see, there's a compare method. We can use that on the then step. We can use the exact same, basically, framework to say, hey, I'll cover that when we get to it, actually. But here we have create instance, we have create set, we can do fill instance. So there's a lot of just neat little helper things. To projection, I don't think I've ever used these before. But the first thing that should strike you is if I blow out all this code, what the heck did I do? I did the wrong one, didn't I? I mean, look at these steps I have. Just look at visually how much code I'm writing. I mean, for the most part, that's pretty Spartan. I mean, some of these are one-liners. And the great thing about this is once you've defined a step, if I now need to go reuse the step in another scenario, SpecFlow just finds it. So if I want to go create a new scenario, let's see, scenario. And I do when. It's even got some, come on, where's my when state? Oh, I'm sorry, that was a given. My bad. User error. It pops up with IntelliSense. I disagree with kind of how they did it because they pop up every single variation. I wish they would just give me the frickin' one. Because what it tries to do is go, oh, do you want this version or that version? Basically, it pops up all the possible steps that could match. And then if you say when I order, thank you, and then you can, you can go ahead and fill it in. So this is handy enough that if you created a good enough set of steps, you could put this in the hands, probably not of just a a tech savage, but somebody who's somewhat tech savvy, and they could actually, they could actually write some tests for you. They probably never will, but they could. in theory. And there's a lot of reuse there. You could do the same thing in unit tests. I don't think it ends up being as clean or as nice, but maybe I'm just not very good at it. All right, so cheat sheet. Okay, I'm going to cover the context. So another thing you can do with SpecFlow is it does have standard hooks. So if you go, I went into this common to find a common CS file here. And in this common file, you have to put the binding again for SpecFlow to find it, but you have some additional attributes. You can say before test is run. You can say before feature, and this here, you guys see that string? This attribute takes as an overload a number, 0 or more tags, essentially. And if you put that tag in there, what it does is, let me show you tag. If your feature is decorated with that tag, which is the @ symbol, and it turns that color, that particular code would run. And you could set something up that you needed for the duration of that feature, which would include all the tests, all the scenarios in here, in this particular feature file. If you need something more granular, you need a bucket, like basically, and consider this almost a session. Some people consider it slightly bad practice if you abuse it, but if you need a session for this particular scenario, like you want to do something in a step, but store it, you could then also use what's called the scenario context. Let's see here. So anyways, these hooks are here to allow you to run, either based on tags, run some code, either at the beginning of all the tests that are run, at the beginning of each scenario, at the end of the scenario. You can do it at the step level, at the beginning of each step, run some code, and then at the end. Usually, I put some comments in here. The way we've used it is before test run. That's if you guys, everyone who loves DI around here, this is where you do your DI junk, right? Set it all up. Know how to build what you want to build. So all I did was put in a bunch of debug statements. So what I'm going to do now then is, because I did that, I'm going to debug it. Oh, I can't do it that way. What am I thinking? And then, thank you for running. View output window. Where's my output window? Thank you. Oh, I probably need a stop in here, don't I? Well, hold on. Let me see. Is it not going to show it to me? There it is. So in here we see all the stuff that there's a bunch. Thank you, Microsoft, for all the other junk. But here before test run, I should have input something different. It outputs all the stuff too. So it's just proving that it's running. Pretty straightforward. Any questions about that? Okay. So let's dissect this step a little bit more. In the background, I have a new tic-tac-toe game. So let's go to the step definition. And I set this property, game provider, to a new game adapter, which implements that interface. And this runs for every feature that's in that file. This game provider is just a private property that basically sets or gets an instance of this particular, of a class that implements this interface. The way I do that, you guys see that scenario context? The scenario context acts, the closest analog I can give you is it's like a session state bag. Everyone here knows what session is, SP.NET. It basically gets instantiated for every scenario. You can put junk in there. It's really handy. You can basically, if you just notice how I'm just doing a get and a set, I'm not specifying a key. The key's optional. I can specify a key. But if I don't specify the key, and this is where it's just beautiful. It's just like, oh, you just have one of these? Okay, I'm going to use the type as a key then. Game provider, and I'm going to stick it in the bag. Now, if you come back and you try to stick another one in there, well, it might override it. But basically, it makes it simple. So I don't have to remember a stupid key. I can just know, well, I'm really only going to have one of these per scenario, so whatever. Just shove it in there, please. And when I come back to get it, so I'm just going to set it, and then it figures out, I think this is an actual, I mean, technically, you know, right, it's doing the whole figuring it out, but technically you could do that, but it's redundant. Put in the type, it just knows it. And then when you do the get, you just specify the type and it's in there. So all that step does is, because I need an instance of the game engine, right? I need it for the duration of the test. That's something that makes sense to stick into scenario context. So I go ahead and I end this step that runs for everything. I new it up and I set it in there. Now once I have that, since this is a simple example, I'm done. I mean, I have that set up and I can do all my scenarios. Any questions about that? If it was the feature context, it's the same thing. It just works at that higher level. All right. So we talked about bindings. We talked about assist. Let's talk about, and then I think I'm going to be out of time, so this will work out. Let's talk about a more complicated scenario. So this is a standard scenario. It runs the background, then it runs these steps. But you sometimes have a need for something more complicated, and then there's this thing called a scenario outline. Now, scenario outline is kind of like a scenario, but the deluxe version. And what this does is it has this additional keyword at the end called examples. And what he does is, for every single thing I've highlighted here, you see the name here and the moves or whatever, and you see how I put this angle bracket moves, angle bracket current player, etc. You guys see all that? It basically generates a test for an independent test for every row that's in this example table. And by convention, it uses whatever's in the first column of this table I provide. So what it's going to do is, for example, let's go back to where it creates the tests, is the name of the test ends up being, you guys can see it up there? Tic-tac-toe, can play games, _ first player wins, second player wins, game in play. You guys see that? And it basically creates a test for, takes this data, sticks it in there based on what I have in this row, and then it generates those 3 tests. So this is a nice way to do kind of a data-driven test if you needed to. We have at Horace Mann something called classification, where we have to figure out, based on your age or whatever, it generates this god-awful 4-digit code that gets sent to this engine that calculates the rate. All the possible options to this thing are probably like, for every one of those digits in that code, there's probably 100. So I was able to write a test to focus on each column of that, and it's all under test now, and that's sweet. And I challenged my testing group to say, do you guys do that every time we release? No, impossible. So this is a very handy feature. In this case, it also reads very much like English. This sucks because it's so long, and this is probably not the best way to do it, but I wanted to show how flexible it is. The name of the test, and it says, given the following moves have been made, so all these moves, and then what I had to do, which I don't like to do, but it's not first normal form, by the way, is I put all the moves in a string and I separated them with a comma, and then I go through and I actually tell the engine, make all those moves in that order. Then, once all those moves are made, then I just verify that the game engine, that it's currently the second player's turn. If you were to actually do this, you would see it made sense, that the game status is that the first player won. In this case, first player is top left. The second move is the other player, right? Because the engine doesn't care. It just says make a move. If you're making a move, it's smart enough to know whose turn it is. So top center, top right, that's 3 in a row up top. First player should have won. The current player is basically whose turn it would be, and it is the second in this case, even though you can't make another move, although I don't have a test for that, but we could write one. Total number of moves made, which should be 5 from the engine, the game board state afterwards. And then we can call the valid moves function to say, hey, are there any valid moves left? If the game's over, there aren't any, so we expect the engine to say no. We do the same thing for second player, except there's one more move. As it turns out, minimum of 6 moves for O. O's the second player, right? For O to win. And I could come through and create every scenario I wanted to create that would be germane towards testing a tic-tac-toe engine. So that's pretty sweet. And I can go into, I basically use the same parse routine for all this. So that being said, 744, I want to just kind of stop here. I've covered all the main things I wanted to cover, hopefully decently. And I want to open it up to you guys for questions.
Hey, Jose, how you doing, by the way?
Hey, how's it going, Lee?
I'm just really curious about something that was in your code. When you were looking at the enumerations, how
Yep.
come you use all byte enumerations instead of integer enumerations? Just curious about that.
I don't know.
Don't know?
I'm like, oh, you can do that? Okay, I'll do that.
Okay.
Because I was performing, I was optimizing, you know,
Right,
premature
right.
optimization. I love to do that. You know how I love to do that.
Right, okay. All right, thanks.
Yeah, by default, it's an integer. But for those of you who don't know, yes, you can specify, I think, any of the...
Value types.
Yeah, although I don't think you can do a string. There's some other limitation.
Really a value type. It's like
Yeah, it's a reference type that acts like a value type. But I don't think you can do a decimal either for an enum, can you? Anyways, exercise for the reader.
Okay, kind of more high-level question. You're using an API here. It seems a bit unlikely. I mean, what if you were using like a web service or a website, something like that?
Well, a web service, I think, is the easy example because you just pull it in, right? If it was, I would use WCF to say pull in the WSDL, pull in the contract, or web API, you know, build that out. And I would have something I would think that would be very similar to this, right? And I could do that through SpecFlow. If you want to use a website, you can do that. There's a ton of examples. When I was putting this presentation together, I'm like, do I just do the standard MVC? Here's mock out the controller, blah, blah, you know, because there's 1,000 of those. So you guys can find that. I wanted to focus more on what I think makes SpecFlow powerful and what it really calls into question. So it was deliberate why I didn't do the web example. But I can give you links to that example. And it's pretty straightforward. You basically, you know how sweet MVC is for supporting DI and all that other stuff. You can basically say, here's a controller, here's your view model, do it, give me the answer. If you want to actually drive it, like literally do HTTP request, HTTP response, you know, that stuff, you need something else, not just SpecFlow. You need a tool like, I think it's called Watin. I don't know how you pronounce it.
Or Selenium is another tool.
Selenium, there's some tools you can use, and you can drive that from that level if you choose to. That gets back to my slide, right? I mean, it's kind of cool. Well, you want to do black box testing? Sure, you can do it. We haven't actually done that in our particular organization. There's kind of a fight about it, and you know, people don't like it when you automate their jobs for some reason. I don't know. And
well, when you don't have a QA team, then automation is the only thing that keeps you sane, really. I mean, if you're doing the work, automation is fantastic.
Right.
If someone else is doing it, you don't care.
yeah, the beautiful thing about that too, even if you're driving it from the UI, my argument with MVC is if you did everything right in MVC, it almost shouldn't matter, right? You should be able to kind of do it without having to go through the view. But I probably would if I was in your situation. Yeah, lost my train of thought. Sorry, I was going there somewhere with that, but it's gone now. It might come back to me. I'll address it if it does.
Yeah, something else. I don't know if you saw my talk last month, but I talked about test doubles frameworks, and I talked about Microsoft Fakes framework, but I also mentioned things like RhinoMox and MockQ. What would you use if you were doing SpecFlow tests? What would you use for a mocking framework?
Well, I think you can use whatever you want. That's the beautiful thing. It's so. I mean, you saw the before test. You just plug in whatever engine you want. I don't think there's any constraint.
Okay.
You know, we use AutoFact because it performs better. Worthless argument, but that's what our architects decided, so that's what we're using.
Sure.
What? Yeah, you could use an inject. What's that? You could use TypeMock. In fact, I didn't want to go there because I wanted to keep this on the subject and not anything controversial. But we have mixed TypeMock and SpecFlow and had incredible success in our organization. So for those of you who don't know what TypeMock is, it lets you basically, it's kind of a cooler version of Microsoft Fakes. They'll get there, version 3 or whatever. Where we were able to say, hey, I want to write tests, but I don't want it to be full-blown integration because I don't want it to actually go and call that service over there that this other group owns that they should be testing anyway and they should have their own frickin' tests for. Right. Instead, just mock that boundary out and everything within my box, so let's test it. So if I'm talking to my database, just let that ride and let it come back and let's do all that. So we kind of drew, based on those themes, that's where we drew the line. incredibly successful. Now, you know, there's trade-offs. In the way we wrote our tests, they're slower than what a good unit test would be. I mean, our tests, we have, I think, 20,000 now. And there's a reason why there's that many, but I won't go into that. But that takes 4 hours for them to run. So for all of them, but typically it's not a big deal. You come in, and for those of you who know me, I'm not a purist. I hate extremists. I think extremists they raise total cost of ownership for companies across the world. I found that this is a great value proposition. Nobody's ever going to let you do all the testing you want to do, right? So
do you have any experience getting people besides developers to help write these tests?
Is that a rhetorical question?
I'm curious, because to me that's the first question that comes up is, who writes these?
We have not gotten that far, but what it has done is help at least pave the way towards a place where you could see that light at the end of the tunnel. Because what you do is you say, well, I need a specification. What do you mean you need just go build it. Come on, you know what I want. Can you tell me like what it's supposed to do? And then you tease out a few, well, you know, if it's this, it needs to do that. And if it's in this pay plan, or if it's the moon is blue, then they're supposed to get it. And then you start to tease out from the business that stuff. And you can have them actually sit down and look at it. And they're always going to be intimidated by it. They're going to be like, oh, what's that? But if you can just get them to sit down and read your SpecFlow test and go, well, and they can get it, which I've done that exercise and been successful with someone who's not tech savvy at all. And they can go, well, wait a second, you also need to check for that. Then you're kind of getting there. Because at least you can get the user acceptance stories defined, get them thinking that way. Then you can get your tests created. And then in some fantasy land, Walgreens or Perfect or whatever it is, they might actually write them for you. But I wouldn't hold my breath.
Couple questions for you. First of all, when you guys were looking at BDD frameworks, did you investigate MSpec at all?
I didn't. Actually, it was another, Paul over there is the one who actually researched this one. And maybe it's intellectually lazy, but this one works so well. You know, I should have probably. The correct answer is yes, you always should look at alternatives. But I really love this tool. I mean, this tool makes testing, I dare to say it's not really fun, but it sure makes it a lot more pleasant.
And you see using this along with unit test and not just replacing unit test.
You want my opinion?
Yeah.
Or you want what? Okay.
Your opinion.
My opinion is yes. Now, I've heard, and I don't know enough about Ruby, that Ruby has tests that are written in this format. That's all they have for tests. I found that this format is incredibly useful for writing my tests, especially the kind of tests where they're data heavy. I mean, creating, right? Let me just go in here. Creating all this plumbing to be able to just read in data and create an object and all. I mean, I could do it, right? I could write that code. So could probably most people here. But why the hell would I want to? And this makes it nice and it's clean and it's. I would use it personally for everything. But.
And you guys use TFS, right?
Yeah.
Are these hard to put in the build?
That's a great question. I think it's theoretically possible. I'm going to let my subsequent expert answer that question.
Yeah, they plug into the build real easy because since they become MS tests,
right.
Microsoft loves them and they just act. That's kind of the great part about how they plug in with the test runner, is it starts off as the feature file, but then after that it's just a regular test.
So if you guys look up here, the delicious standard, please don't be a moron and do anything in here because it's never going to mean anything and it's never going to stay. So standard warning, which everyone should have for this. And then this is what it emits. Here's the feature, and here are the actual class initialization. Let's see if we can collapse this. Come on. Scenario teardown. You can see it's embedding some of these things will look familiar, and then it just generates all these unit tests. Or n-unit tests, if that's your, what floats your boat. So second player wins, it calls this method, and you could walk through this. It's not complicated code. It really isn't. In fact, this framework is so pluggable, I was able to take the interface that drives that front end and actually repurpose it for something else. But it may not be best practice, so I won't talk about how or why, but you can do that because I've done that. I think it was to load, no, I know what it was. I wanted to load some data in a static place, like a list of valid driver's licenses, instead of having to hard code them in every test. And so I just created my own plugin engine for a particular feature and put a tag that said, hey, use this engine instead. And I was able to basically say, because what I really wanted to do was say, I don't want to have to put this crap in code, right? I want to have it in this nice table format so I did that, and it worked well. And then it basically would load it into a cache, and it was done.
Microsoft is getting kind of into the async camp of things. And one of the things that happens when you go multi-threaded is it's nice to integration test to make sure that when you're doing these types of things, you can stay thread safe. Like MVC often stays single-threaded, but you'll see it's not always. But starting with async, you now start having different kind of things you need to kind of test from an integration standpoint in terms of how it works for sequencing, or you're not sequencing dependent. So the question is, are there any ways to adapt SpecFlow to fit under those scenarios? Because it would be nice to automate that as opposed to just manually trying to scaffold it up or PowerShell something up and just kind of hammer a system. Right.
So what you're asking is if you had an async scenario within SpecFlow, could it handle that? You know, I don't know. I don't know what you would do. I would think that when it runs pretty linearly. I do believe, though, that there are ways to kick it off and to say, I want you to run all these tests, you know, all at the same time. I think that's a Visual Studio feature, just for running your unit tests. So I think what you could do is create your set of tests in SpecFlow, right? And then launch it in that, and then it's still not, to me, you know, unless you figure out a way to really do it the way an engineer would, that approach almost seems more like the way someone on the Blackbox spectrum would do it, right? Something you would uncover maybe even through load tests. So again, me ever the pragmatist and the minimalist, I would say, is that something we can catch in a load test? But if not, if you wanted to do an async, maybe you could do it that way. I don't know if it's the best way. You could certainly, I mean, all these steps just come down to code, right? So I'm sure everyone knows you could do something with that regard.
Right, but being able to automate or get some sort of integration verification that you're somewhat thread safe without huge amounts of trauma and scaffolding is one of those wart areas around software that would be good to be able to find an automated approach.
Of course, you know, when you're the developer, right, I would hope you have other ways of trying to verify that than resorting to what, you know, the non-technical person would, right? Because to me, that's sort of like, let's just keep banging on it, right, and see what happens. It's a good question, though.
Okay, well, why don't we clap and say thank you?